This video is a reminder because what I'm about to teach in this video, I told you this before several times past years, but it's important to give reminders because reminders also build people up. So we're going to Mark chapter 6 and we're going to read the first 6 verses. I'm reading from the King James Version. And he, that's Christ, went out from thence and came into his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many, hearing him, were astonished, saying, From whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, and Joseph, and of Judah, and of Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended at him. But Jesus said unto them, A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and amongst his own kin, and in his own house. And he could there do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands upon a few sick folk, and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief, and he went around about the villages teaching. There are few things here that are quite remarkable. But let's talk about the context. Christ had his ministry. He, his 12 disciples, were going around preaching the kingdom of God, and Christ was doing mighty works. So Christ had a big following, but of that big following, he only kept those 12 disciples close to him. And this is something that you need to learn from. Just because you have a big following doesn't mean that everyone in a big following is following you for the right reason. If you have a following because you have influence, okay. When you have influence, you have a following. But why are they following you? Enemies will follow you also. Satan was following Christ. Demons were stalking Christ. So just because you have a following doesn't mean that everyone within that following is there for the right reason. So Christ had his 12 disciples that supported him, and they, as a team, went around. So Christ decided he's going to his own country. Well, that means the place where he grew up in Galilee. The disciples went with him. So the disciples would think, okay, the master wants to go to where he grew up, so now we have the chance to see where he grew up. So it was an interesting experience for the disciples also. The disciples now would see where the master grew up. They would meet the relatives of the master. So the disciples would think, okay, good. But was it a good experience? No. When the Sabbath day was come, remember during that time you had the synagogues where the Hebrews would come together as a culture. Because remember, they were under Roman occupation, and they were keeping their culture alive, basically. And they would read from the Old Testament. So when the Sabbath day was come, Christ went into the synagogue, and he began to teach. So Christ appeared with authority, because he couldn't just enter a synagogue and begin to teach. He couldn't. Yet he did. He had no religious education. He didn't graduate at any religious institution. Yet he was there teaching. And the people there in Nazareth, Nazareth is a town where Christ grew up. Nazareth was a town in Galilee. The people of that town, they heard about all the mighty works Christ was doing. And when Christ was there in person, they came to the synagogue, and everyone there, they experienced the wisdom of God that Christ was speaking about. So what was their reaction? And many, hearing him, were astonished. So they were shocked. They were thinking, what? This is, I'm going to paraphrase now. They were thinking, what? Hold on a minute. This man, by the way, why didn't you just call him Jesus? Why did you call him this? Why? So you see that they're distancing themselves from him. They could have said, where did Jesus get his teaching from? They didn't say that. They said, whence had this man? So they were distancing themselves from him. So first they were astonished, and then they distanced themselves. They were thinking like, okay, this man has a lot of knowledge, but he didn't graduate at any religious institution. Neither did he graduate at the Greek academy. How come he has all this knowledge? Who gave it unto him? And not only does he have a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge, he has power. He's doing mighty works. So, understand this, believer. The people there, they knew that Christ was a real deal. They knew that the wisdom he had was real, and they knew that the works of his hands were powerful. So, it wasn't just rumors they heard about him that they could just dismiss. They had evidence into their face of the wisdom and the power working through Christ. But why did they distance themselves from him? Emotionally. Now here it comes. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? One thing here. You never call a man the son of a woman in the Hebrew culture, because that would imply that she was either a prostitute or that her husband or her man left her when she was pregnant. So to call someone the son of and then the name of their mother was a big insult. You didn't do that. So not only did they distance themselves from him, but they expressed their contempt of him also. Is this not the carpenter? But hold on a minute. I don't care if Christ was a carpenter. By the way, he was a carpenter. He left Nazareth and went to Capernaum to get work, where he lived for a while, so he was a carpenter. But that doesn't matter that that was his earthly profession. There were mighty works that he was doing. He had wisdom and power. But they couldn't deal with the fact that he was so powerful. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? So this is their contempt of him. This is how they treated him. This is how they looked at him. The brother of James and of Joseph and of Judah and of Simon, are not his sisters here with us? And that shows you that the relatives of Christ were there when this was happening. Why didn't any of his relatives stand up for him saying, hey, don't talk about Jesus like that? He's my brother, remember? None of them did, because they all wanted to get along with society. And they, and that includes the relatives of Christ, were offended at him. Now look at this carefully here. You have one of their own who went away in his 20s, because Christ left Nazareth in his 20s. He went to Capernaum to get work, because there was no work in Nazareth. Christ had his profession over there. He made some money. He had his own place to stay. And later Christ left his house, and he used the small fortune he had for his ministry. So God, in the flesh, he was practical. But they didn't realize he was God. Okay? But they just thought of him as this carpenter, this son of Mary, because they thought Mary was cheating on Joseph or whatever. So he had a bad reputation based on what they thought about his parents. And that also happens in this world often. People will often think bad of you because of an associate of yours. If your father was disliked, people may dislike you because you remind them of your father. And because the way they treated your father was out of hand, them seeing you now reflects back onto them. And now they feel guilty of how they treated your father. So them seeing you shows onto them how narcissistic they were against your father, because your father was affected by how they treated him, but now you were affected also indirectly. So they victimize you indirectly also. They don't want to face this. So now, to protect their own sanity, they will blame you. Sometimes you're blamed and hated due to your parents or due to the ethnic group you belong to. That is, as you can call, associated blame. You're blamed due to an association, even though you're not to blame at all. So the people had one of their own that made it. But here's the thing. For them to accept that Christ had all that power and all that wisdom, that implied that they had to recognize that they didn't have it. So they had to recognize that Christ was in advantage, that Christ was powerful. And the thing about being powerful is that you can make decisions without needing the consent of someone else. Because someone may have authority, may have the power, you can get results. So Christ was able to get results without them. So Christ didn't even have to go back to his hometown to visit them. He could have just stayed away. So then they also had to acknowledge that Christ came there out of goodwill. But if they had to acknowledge all of this, especially Christ's goodwill, then they also had to admit that they did not have goodwill towards him, that they were talking behind his back. So now all their filth and darkness is exposed. So now they're upset because Christ's presence means they need to change and they need to process and face things. They didn't want that. So they become upset. They now begin to blame Christ for their darkness. So this was them resisting Christ. But Jesus said unto them, so the people that were offended at him, he told them into their face, a prophet is not without honor, but in his own country and amongst his own kin and in his own house. And he could there do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands on a few sick folk and healed them. Now, look at this carefully. Christ is in Nazareth, where he grew up. Since Christ left, other people also came to Nazareth. New people were born. Some people migrated over there. So there were people there that weren't familiar with Christ. A few of them. But the people that knew Christ, they rejected him. They refused to acknowledge him. So they formed a resistance against Christ. They formed a resistance against his power because they knew that he had wisdom and mighty works. So they were resisting his influence. And by doing that, they hindered Christ from reaching people. Now, Christ, being God, could easily have crushed them with his strength, but he didn't want to do that because he had a greater purpose. So it's not that they could limit God, because God could have crushed them easily. Okay? Because even in that human body, he was still God. But we who follow God are not God. So we don't have the ability out of ourselves to crush people anytime they do stupid against us. Neither is it a desirable thing for us to do, because often people do stupid against you to get you in the negative just like they are. So the violence, because there's violence over here, the violence of the people that refused to acknowledge him hindered others that needed Christ. And some of you are listening to this video who are also subscribed to the channel. The reason why you encountered so many difficulties, the reason why you went through so much stuff during your lifetime till now, is partly due to the resistance of others who didn't want any solutions. You grew up somewhere. You didn't choose to be born, so you didn't even choose where you would be born nor where you grew up. And where you grew up affected you. Okay, whether you acknowledge it or not. I hope you acknowledge it. I hope you are realistic. So if in a place you grew up, people were not open to solutions, but they were holding on to the negative, their negativity affected you. If they were not into solutions, that means their violence affected you. And Christ was still around, and he put his hands on a few sick folk, and they were healed. But there were more people that needed help. But here's the thing. If Christ would have ignored their resistance and do mighty works anyway, they would have felt attacked. Because they have a negative will against Christ, and now they expect Christ to put up with their negativity. And if Christ would have openly said no in his actions towards the negativity, and people would have received from Christ, those people, when Christ would leave, they would go up with people and bother them. And believer, that is also what's happening to you. There are those in the world who don't want to acknowledge Christ. You acknowledge him, so you receive the blessing, and you walk in the blessing, and they see that you walk in the blessing, and they are without the blessing. So now, instead of them acknowledging that it's their own fault that they are without the blessing, now they're turning on you. Now they're persecuting you. So now they're endangering you. Now they're turning the hatred they have against Christ on you. So now they're violating you and victimizing you because they don't want to face themselves. This is what was going on here. So Christ was smart by not doing mighty works over there. So he and his disciples went to the villages. Just imagine what were affected this had on the disciples. The disciples witnessed this violence. They were shocked also. Now, the text here does not reveal much about the disciples because Christ is the center. But it's also affected the disciples. The disciples were also shocked that Christ's own people treated him with such violence and such foulness. And this is another thing I want to point out to you, believer. There are times you're praying for stuff and you're decreeing and declaring, but the Holy Spirit is not allowing your prayers to come to pass. Yet. Why not? Because the Holy Spirit sees that the people around you at the time, they are against him. They are against the truth. They are against reality. They are against complying with justice, and they are against solutions. But in daily life, they pretend to be all for solutions. Some may even pretend to be for Christ. Well, actually, it's not pretending. They're faking. They're faking that they want solutions, and they're faking that they are interested in the truth and they're interested in Christ. But God sees who they really are. Now, their scam works on fellow human beings and also works on you. But God sees who they really are. And God sees that when you begin to walk in his strength, and when you bring great manifestations to pass by walking in his strength, he sees that all those people will become vile murderers and stalkers after you. He sees that people will turn on you with deep-rooted homicidal bitterness. He sees it. That's why there are times God will delay some of the things you've prayed for, so that you won't have to put up with the danger his enemies will generate towards you. Because God's enemies will endanger you to prove themselves against God. They want to validate their negative will, so they will endanger you to make a point. That's what reprobates do. And that's what enablers of reprobates do also. They're not all reprobates, but they're either a reprobate or they're an enabler, or else they wouldn't be involved in this negative thing. Learn from this. A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country and among his own kin and his own house. His own country, that means his ethnicity, where he's from, his own kin, that means relatives, his own house, but people he is in contact with. Just realize that there are people near you that will not accept you walking by faith. They won't accept you having solutions. They won't accept you having blessings. They won't accept you being happy, being joyful, being freed. They won't accept you operating a life in abundance because they won't have a grip on you. And because they can't have a grip on you, they can't control you. And because their violence doesn't work on you, they become bitter and homicidal. Because these people, they became bitter and homicidal towards Christ. In another gospel report, it's written that they tried to throw him off a cliff. Now, some people say Christ only went to Nazareth once. Others said he went there twice. Now, based on scripture, I say he went there twice. But whether it was only once or twice, it doesn't matter. If he only went there once with his disciples, then that's it. But if he went there once on his own and later with his disciples, but that's what the Gospels are hinting at, that he went once alone and another time he went with his disciples. But it doesn't matter if he went there once or twice. It's recorded that they were against him, and in one of the cases, where it was the only case or not, they tried to kill him. They tried to throw him off a cliff, so they began to stalk him. They began to accuse him, stalk him, and it turned into physical violence. They tried to harm, they wanted to kill him. Homicidal bitterness. Why? Because they didn't want to let go. They didn't want to be dealt with. And believer, listen to what I'm saying here. There will be people developing homicidal bitterness because they don't want to face themselves. They were already bitter in their attitudes. But seeing you in the power, in the strength, trigger that bitterness. So now, instead of faith in bitterness and looking for deliverance, they are advancing in that bitterness. Did you make them advance in bitterness? No. But they will blame you. This is something Christ, God himself, encountered. So don't think you will bypass this belief, or you won't. So stop this worldly clinging onto people. Because often it's the people that you cling onto the most. Often it's those people that will turn into the ones that will pull the trigger on you. You expect it's the people out there who feel threatened by you and therefore attack you, that they're the ones who will pull the trigger. Because you have folks out there that will encounter you and they're just terrified by the strength you have. And they act out. Those are just desperate cowards. That's what those people are. But you expect it's one of those desperate cowards that may pull the trigger or take some life-threatening action against you. But no. The ones that are more likely to pull the trigger or to take life-threatening actions against you are those close to you who have a vested interest in keeping you in the negative. Yes, you have people with a vested interest in keeping you in darkness, in keeping you in defeat, keeping you in sickness, keeping you in failure, keeping you in all that other stuff. Why? Because when you are in the negative, just like they are at ease. They don't have to face themselves. Or if you worsen them, then they have narcissistic relief by comparing themselves to you. But when you're doing better than them, and it's obvious that the only reason they're not doing as good as you do is because they're refusing it, now you're in danger. Sooner or later, they will try to physically kill you. It's just a matter of time. So always agree with Christ, keep your eyes open, and be at peace.